The Baltic in the mid-16th century was not a quiet sea. Its waters were cold, iron-gray, and restless, a mirror to the ambitions of the powers that circled it. The wind came in sharp from the north, sweeping over the Gulf of Finland and the Gulf of Riga, carrying with it the scent of salt, pine, and gunpowder yet to be fired. This was a frontier, where kingdoms touched one another like blades pressed edge to edge, and where the smallest spark could ignite a war that would last decades. The Livonian Confederation, a patchwork of territories held together by the aging Livonian order, was a relic from another age. Its knights wore the cross of the sword, but their ranks had thinned, their fortresses aged, and their coffers emptied. They governed a fragile league of bishoprics, merchant towns, and German-speaking nobility, a world balanced precariously between faith and survival. Yet within its borders lay ports and strongholds that every great power of the north coveted. To the east stood Muscovy, ruled by Ivan IV, remembered in history as the Terrible. For him, the Baltic was not just a sea, it was the road to power. Russia's vast land empire was bound by forests and steppe, but without a warm water port, her trade was shackled. Narva, Reval, and the ports of Livonia were keys to a door Muscovy had long been denied. Ivan's court spoke of divine destiny, of expanding the Orthodox faith, but his soldiers spoke of conquest, plunder, and glory. To the southwest lay the union of Poland and Lithuania, a vast realm of grain-rich plains and cavalry unmatched in Europe. King Sigismund II Augustus saw Livonia as both shield and prize. Shield, because Russian power in the Baltic would press upon Lithuania's own borders. Prize, because control of the Daugava River and Riga's thriving trade could enrich the Commonwealth beyond measure. The banners of the White Eagle and the Lithuanian Knight were ready to be called to war. And to the north, across the cold Gulf, Sweden watched like a hawk. The Vasa kings dreamed of a Baltic empire, a dominium maris Balticae, a kingdom of the sea. Their ships were strong, their armies disciplined, and their ambition as sharp as any sword. The Swedish crown had tasted conflict with Denmark and seen the value of controlling the eastern shores. This was not a single war waiting to happen. It was a tangle of rivalries, each thread pulling at the others. Religion, trade, pride, and survival all converged on the same narrow stretch of coast. And in the winter of 1558, the first blow would fall. It began with a demand. Ivan IV, claiming Livonia owed tribute, sent envoys to Riga with terms that were impossible to meet. When the Livonian order hesitated, Russian armies marched. The snow was deep, the rivers frozen, but the horsemen of Muscovy crossed them like dark waves breaking on ice. Their banners bore the double-headed eagle. Their lances were tipped with steel that had drunk blood on the steppes. They did not come to negotiate. They came to take. The Northern Cross was about to be tested. The year 1558 opened in silence, the kind of silence that comes before snow breaks under marching boots. Across the frozen Narva River, the first Russian banners appeared like blood against the white. The winter air carried the muffled thunder of hooves, and before the Livonian order could rally its scattered forces, the storm had arrived. Ivan IV's army was not a single, uniform host. It was a mosaic of war. Boyar cavalry clad in lamellar armor, Tatar horse archers riding swift and silent, musketeers in fur-lined caftans, and siege crews hauling bombards over the ice. Behind them came supply trains of sledges loaded with grain, powder, and the tools to break walls. It was a war machine meant to move swiftly, to strike hard before the thaw. Their first target was Narva, a small but strategic port on the Gulf of Finland. Its walls were solid, its garrison disciplined, but it was isolated, and isolation is the death of fortresses. Russian artillery began its thunder, hurling stone and iron into Narva's towers. The sound echoed across the frozen river, each blast a promise of what would follow. After days of pounding, a breach was opened. In the gray light of morning, Russian infantry poured through, their boots crunching over snow stained red. By the week's end, the double-headed eagle flew over Narva's gate. From there, the Muscovite tide turned inland, towards Dorpat, known today as Tartu. Dorpat was not just a fortress, it was a university town, a center of learning and trade. The Livonian order had held it for centuries, But now its defenders faced an enemy who believed they fought under God's command. The siege lasted weeks, Russian guns and sappers working methodically while hunger gnawed at the defenders. When the gates finally fell, Dorpat's capture sent shockwaves through the Baltic. The message was clear: the Livonian order's walls could be broken. Panic spread. Merchants in Riga whispered that the order was finished. Farmers fled the countryside, driving their herds southward. The order's Grand Master, Wilhelm von Furstenberg, sent desperate appeals for aid to Poland-Lithuania, to Sweden, even to the Holy Roman Emperor. But alliances in the 16th century moved slowly, bound by pride and politics, while Ivan's armies moved fast. In Livonia's towns, the people began to speak of the Russian advance as if it were a winter flood, unstoppable, inevitable, swallowing everything in its path. Yet far away, in Vilnius and Stockholm, men in warm halls were already plotting how to turn this disaster into opportunity. The war was no longer just between Livonia and Muscovy. It was becoming a struggle for the entire Baltic. The Northern Cross had been struck, and now it would be reforged in the furnace of war. In the early months of 1559, the Livonian order stood at the edge of ruin. The Red Winter of 1558 had stripped them of Narva and Dorpat, shaken their prestige, and shattered the illusion that their walls could keep Muscovy at bay. Every week brought news of another village burned, another fortress abandoned. The Grand Master's council chambers in Riga were filled with voices, some urging desperate resistance, others whispering that the only hope lay in surrender to a greater protector. Grand Master Wilhelm von Furstenberg knew the truth. Livonia could no longer stand alone. The Knights of the Sword had grown too few, their resources too thin, and their enemies too many. He sent envoys riding south and west, their cloaks stiff with frost, carrying letters sealed with the cross of the order. These letters were pleas, offers, and veiled bargains, addressed to King Sigismund II Augustus of Poland-Lithuania and to the Crown of Sweden. Poland-Lithuania responded first. In Vilnius, Sigismund II received the Livonian envoys in the Great Hall, its walls hung with tapestries of past victories. The Commonwealth's chancellors argued fiercely. Some saw Livonia as a burden, a failing relic whose defense would drain their treasury. Others, the Lithuanian magnates, saw it as essential. If Muscovy secured a Baltic port, they warned, Russian armies would be at Lithuania's throat within a year. Sigismund, cautious but calculating, offered a pact. Under the Treaty of Vilnius, the southern part of Livonia would enter a personal union with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while retaining its privileges and autonomy. In return, the Commonwealth would send troops and money to defend it. For the Livonian order, it was a bitter bargain, the surrender of independence for survival. But survival was all they had left. Meanwhile, in Stockholm, King Eric XIV of Sweden watched events with cold interest. Sweden had long desired to control the eastern shores of the Baltic, and the chaos in Livonia was an open door. Swedish envoys promised assistance to the order, but their price was clear: ports and fortresses in the north, particularly Reval. To the Swedes, Reval was not just a city. It was the key to dominating trade in the Gulf of Finland. When their troops landed in 1561, the blue and yellow banners rose over Reval's towers, not as liberators, but as new masters. The Livonian War was no longer a single invasion. It had become a great chessboard where every move was made not just against an enemy, but against supposed allies. Poland-Lithuania sought to bind Livonia to its crown. Sweden sought to carve its own Baltic kingdom. And Muscovy sought to crush them both before they could unite. By 1560, the stage was set for a war that would consume the region for a quarter of a century. The Northern Cross, the symbol of Livonia, now flew alongside the White Eagle and the Three Crowns. But whether these banners would stand together or fall separately was a question no one could answer. The summer of 1560 was heavy with tension. The Baltic sun hung low and golden over the fields. But for Livonia, beauty had become a mask for fear. The order's new alliance with Poland-Lithuania was still more ink than action. Swedish forces held Reval and the north, but their strength was spread thin. Into this fragile landscape, Muscovy struck again. The target was Urgim, a small village in northern Livonia, not far from the heartland of the order's remaining strongholds. The Russians came swiftly, a host of perhaps 12,000, led by boyar princes loyal to Ivan IV. Their scouts swept ahead like shadows, cutting off messengers and choking the flow of information. By the time the Livonian Order's forces assembled, they were already facing a storm they could not match. Grand Master Wilhelm von Furstenberg and his commanders mustered around 6,000 men, knights in aging armor, German mercenaries, and local levies armed with pikes and crossbows. They hoped to surprise the Russians before their numbers could concentrate. But at Urgim, it was they who were surprised. The battle began at dawn. Mist clung to the grass, muffling the sound of hooves until the first Russian cavalry charge shattered the quiet. Tatar horse archers swept the flanks, loosing arrows in black, hissing clouds. The Order's knights tried to counter with a heavy cavalry strike, their lances lowered, sunlight glinting on their mail. For a moment, they broke through, and then they were enveloped. The Muscovite infantry advanced with shields and polearms, pushing relentlessly. Russian arquebusiers fired into the press of men, their smoke curling in the summer air. The Livonian lines wavered, then buckled. Surrounded, the knights fought in small knots, their banners disappearing one by one. By midday, the field was littered with the dead, and Urgim was a slaughterhouse. The defeat was absolute. Hundreds of knights were killed or captured. Among the prisoners were some of the Order's most experienced leaders, hauled away in chains to Moscow. The loss crippled Livonia's military strength and sent shockwaves through its fragile alliances. For Ivan IV, Urgim was proof that his armies could crush Western knights as easily as steppe tribes. For Poland-Lithuania and Sweden, it was a warning. Muscovy was not a distant threat, but a predator at their doorstep. And for the Livonian Order, it was the beginning of the end. By the close of 1560, the Order as an independent power was effectively broken. In the years that followed, Livonia would be carved up between Poland-Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, all while Muscovy sought to seize the largest share. But the war was far from over. The fall of the Order only cleared the board for greater players to clash. The Northern Cross no longer flew over a united land. Now it was a banner carried by exiles, mercenaries, and survivors, a symbol of a war that was consuming the whole Baltic. The fall of the Livonian Order after Urgim was not the end of the war, it was its transformation. Where once the fight had been between Muscovy and a faltering medieval order, it was now a contest between crowns. The Baltic, always a meeting place of merchants and warriors, became the stage for one of the century's most complex wars. In 1561, the Treaty of Vilnius took effect. Southern Livonia, including Riga and the rich lands along the Daugava River, came under the protection and authority of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. King Sigismund II Augustus sent troops to garrison key fortresses, their red and white banners snapping in the northern wind. The Lithuanian cavalry, swift and deadly, rode patrols through the forests and plains, their long lances glinting in the pale sunlight. The Commonwealth had entered the war not out of charity, but to ensure that Muscovy's reach ended at Livonia's borders. At the same time, Sweden acted with speed and precision. In the north, the city of Reval and much of Estonian territory declared allegiance to King Erik XIV, preferring Swedish rule to Russian conquest. Swedish warships arrived in the harbor, their hulls creaking under the weight of cannon. The Three Crowns flag was raised over the city's walls, signaling to the world that Sweden now claimed the gateway to the Gulf of Finland. Swedish garrisons quickly fortified their positions, understanding that the Muscovite army could appear at any time. This new balance of power alarmed Ivan IV. The Tsar had counted on a quick conquest of Livonia, but now his armies faced professional, well-equipped foes on two fronts. To the south, the Commonwealth's forces dug in. To the north, the Swedes strengthened their coastal fortresses. What had been a campaign of expansion was turning into a long, grinding war. The years 1562 to 1564 saw fierce skirmishes and sieges. Swedish forces pushed east, capturing key castles and cutting into Muscovite supply lines. In the south, Lithuanian troops defended Riga and struck at Russian outposts along the Daugava. The war's nature changed. It was no longer swift cavalry raids and isolated sieges, but a struggle of attrition, with both sides pouring resources into the conflict. Diplomacy swirled around the battlefield. Denmark, long a rival to Sweden, eyed the situation with suspicion and ambition. The Danish king, Frederick II, began considering intervention, not out of loyalty to either side, but to ensure Denmark would not be shut out of the Baltic's trade and politics. The war was drawing in every power with a stake in the north. By the middle of the 1560s, the Livonian War had become what Ivan IV had feared most, a coalition war. And in such wars, even the strongest armies can bleed themselves dry. The Northern Cross now flew beside the White Eagle of Poland, the Lithuanian Knight, and the Three Crowns of Sweden. But in the shadows, Denmark's red banner with its white cross was being prepared, another lion ready to enter the hunt. By 1565, the Baltic had become a sea of banners. Muscovy still held vast stretches of Livonia, Sweden controlled Reval and much of Estonia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth defended the south. But now, a fourth power moved to stake its claim, Denmark. King Frederick II of Denmark watched the Livonian War with a cold strategist's eye. His kingdom controlled the Øresund Strait, the gateway between the Baltic and the North Sea, and profited greatly from tolls on all shipping that passed through. But if Sweden gained full dominance over the eastern Baltic coast, Danish power would be threatened. Frederick could not allow that. And so, under the guise of protecting parts of northern Estonia, Danish troops landed in 1565, planting the red flag with the white cross over the stronghold of Weissenstein, paid. This intervention did more than bring another army into Livonia. It tangled the Livonian War with another great conflict, the Northern 7 Years' War, 1563 to 1570. That war, fought between Sweden and a Denmark-Poland alliance, raged across Scandinavia and the Baltic, turning the region into one vast, interconnected battlefield. For the people of Livonia, this was no longer a war for survival against a single invader. It was a chessboard where every square was contested by multiple kings. In the north, Swedish and Danish troops clashed in bloody sieges and winter campaigns. In the south, Polish-Lithuanian forces skirmished with Muscovite detachments, trying to hold the line along the Daugava River. In the east, Ivan IV's army struck wherever they saw weakness, sometimes hitting Swedish forts, sometimes Commonwealth positions, their aim to keep their enemies divided. The winter of 1566 to 1567 was especially brutal. Armies marched through snowbound forests, their breath freezing in the air, horses collapsing from cold and hunger. Towns changed hands multiple times, burned each time by the retreating side. The war was no longer swift or glorious. It was attrition, frostbite, and famine. Civilians fled to walled cities, where overcrowding and disease claimed almost as many lives as the sword. Diplomats worked as tirelessly as soldiers. Envoys from all sides shuttled between Stockholm, Copenhagen, Vilnius, and Moscow, seeking alliances, truces, or betrayals that might shift the balance. But no agreement could hold for long. Every gain was fragile, every peace temporary. By 1570, after years of inconclusive fighting, Denmark, Sweden, and the Commonwealth agreed to a temporary settlement in their own conflict, the Treaty of Stettin, but the Livonian War itself burned on. Muscovy still held much of the east, and Ivan IV had no intention of relinquishing it. The other crowns, though weary, refused to abandon their footholds. The Northern Cross now stood in the middle of a battlefield not of its choosing, surrounded by lions and eagles, each waiting for the other to weaken. And in the east, the Tsar was preparing for the next great push. The early 1570s brought no relief to the Baltic. The snow melted into rivers swollen with spring floods, and with it came the rumble of Muscovite drums. Ivan IV, the Tsar who had already drenched Livonia in fire, launched a new offensive. His armies poured westward, banners of St. George snapping in the wind, determined to crush Swedish strongholds in Estonia and drive deeper into the Commonwealth's heartland. Muscovy's war machine was vast and relentless. Columns of horsemen swept through the countryside, burning farms and scattering refugees. Siege trains followed, their heavy bombards dragged by teams of oxen. Town after town fell. Small wooden fortresses splintered under cannon fire, while stone castles endured weeks of bombardment before surrendering to starvation. Those who resisted too long paid the price. Entire populations deported east, their villages left as charred skeletons. Yet the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was about to gain a champion. In 1576, Stephen Bathory, Prince of Transylvania, ascended to the Polish throne, marrying Anna Jagiellon and becoming King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Bathory was no courtly figurehead. He was a soldier king, disciplined and cunning, with a clear vision. Muscovy had to be driven out of Livonia entirely. Bathory immediately began reforming his forces. He called for the mustering of the famed Polish Hussars, the winged cavalry whose charges could shatter enemy lines, and brought in foreign mercenaries skilled in siege warfare. Under his command, the Commonwealth army became sharper, faster, more disciplined. While Bathory built his strength, the Livonian countryside bled. The Muscovite advance of 1577 was devastating. Scovian and Tatar auxiliaries raided deep into enemy territory, and entire provinces were left wasteland. Swedish garrisons clung desperately to their ports, while local Livonian nobles, caught between multiple crowns, switched allegiances as often as the wind shifted. It was in this chaos that Bathory made his move. In 1578, he launched a counteroffensive in coordination with Swedish forces. The Battle of Winden, Cesis, became the turning point. A combined Swedish Commonwealth army crushed a much larger Muscovite force, capturing artillery and breaking the Tsar's momentum. For the first time in years, it seemed the tide might turn. But Ivan IV was not finished. He withdrew to regroup, summoning more troops from the depths of Muscovy. What followed would be a clash not just of armies, but of wills, the Tsar's stubborn resolve against Bathory's relentless drive. The Northern Cross now gleamed with a faint light of hope, but the shadow of Muscovy still loomed over Livonia. The war's final, brutal phase was about to begin. By 1579, Stephen Bathory's preparations were complete. The Commonwealth army he now commanded was no longer a patchwork of feudal levies and unsteady mercenaries. It was a finely tuned war machine. The winged hussars gleaming in polished steel, German and Hungarian infantry in disciplined ranks, artillery trains ready to blast through fortress walls. His goal was simple: drive Muscovy from Livonia and carry the fight deep into Ivan IV's lands. The campaign began with the siege of Polotsk in 1579. Polotsk was more than a fortress. It was a key Muscovite stronghold guarding the Dwina River route into the heart of Lithuania. The Tsar had heavily garrisoned it, confident it could withstand any assault. But Bathory's siege engineers, supported by constant artillery fire, methodically reduced its defenses. After weeks of bombardment and sapping, the walls gave way, and the Commonwealth banners rose above the smoking ruins. The victory electrified Poland-Lithuania. It was proof that the Tsar could be beaten. In 1580, Bathory pressed the advantage. He marched into Veliky Luki, another fortress town in Muscovy's western approaches. The siege was relentless. Muscovite defenders resisted fiercely but were eventually overwhelmed. With each victory, Bathory cut deeper into Muscovy's defensive ring, tightening the noose around Ivan IV's positions in Livonia. But it was the campaign of 1581 that would test the Commonwealth like never before. Bathory set his sights on Pskov, one of Muscovy's greatest cities and a bastion of stone, moat, and iron resolve. Taking Pskov would not just cripple Muscovy's defense, it would humiliate the Tsar himself. The siege of Pskov became legendary. The Commonwealth army encircled the city, bombarding it day and night. Mines were dug under the walls. Assaults were launched across frozen moats. Inside, the defenders, soldiers, townsfolk, and even monks fought back with equal determination. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, but still Pskov did not yield. Winter set in, turning the siege lines into frozen camps where soldiers huddled by smoky fires, their armor rimed with frost. Bathory, ever the strategist, realized that a total breakthrough might cost too much blood. Instead, he tightened the blockade, using diplomacy as much as force. Envoys began to move between camps, and the Tsar, weary from years of war and facing threats from the south, grew more willing to talk. The war was reaching its breaking point. For over 2 decades, Livonia had been a crucible where armies shattered and empires bled. Now, at the gates of Pskov, the fate of the Northern Cross would be decided, not by one final battle, but by the terms of peace that both sides could endure. By the winter of 1581 to 1582, the war had bled all its combatants dry. For Muscovy, the siege of Pskov was a grim reminder that even the Tsar's most fortified cities were no longer untouchable. Inside the Kremlin, Ivan IV, the once unstoppable Terrible, now faced crises on multiple fronts. In the south, the Crimean Tatars threatened raids. In the east, restive provinces demanded attention. In the west, the Polish-Lithuanian army stood poised to break deeper into his heartlands. The war that had begun in glory had turned into a grinding nightmare. Stephen Bathory, too, understood the limits of war. His sieges had been costly, his troops weary from campaigning through bitter Baltic winters. And while Poland-Lithuania had the momentum, it lacked the resources for a full invasion of Muscovy's core territories without risking collapse elsewhere. The Commonwealth's Sejm, Parliament, had grown restless under the burden of war taxes, and mercenary pay was draining the treasury. It was under these circumstances that the first real moves toward peace began. Pope Gregory XIII, concerned about the Catholic-Protestant balance in the north and wary of further instability, encouraged mediation. Envoys from the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire, and neutral Baltic powers began shuttling between the warring camps. The most important mediator, however, was Antonio Passavino, a Jesuit diplomat and papal legate, whose mission was to broker a settlement. Talks began in the small village of Yamzopolski, west of Pskov, in January 1582. The negotiations were tense, with each side unwilling to appear weak. The Commonwealth demanded the return of all Livonian territory, plus Muscovy's surrender of key fortresses like Polotsk. Ivan IV countered with demands for recognition of his sovereignty over at least part of Livonia. Weeks passed in argument and stalemate, with Passavino shuttling between camps through snow and mud. Finally, a compromise was reached. The Truce of Yamzopolski, signed on January 15, 1582, ended hostilities between Muscovy and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for 10 years. Under its terms, Muscovy renounced all claims to Livonia and returned Polotsk to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth kept its recent conquests, cementing control over Livonia's key towns and fortresses. No territorial gains were made by Muscovy, a bitter pill for Ivan IV, who had started the war seeking Baltic access. For the Tsar, it was not a victory but a necessary retreat. For Bathory, it was a triumph. Poland-Lithuania emerged from the war with enhanced prestige and expanded borders. Yet the Livonian War was not fully over. While Muscovy and the Commonwealth laid down arms, Sweden remained in the field. Charles IX and his commanders still sought to tighten Sweden's grip over northern Livonia and the vital port of Narva. Separate negotiations between Muscovy and Sweden would drag on until the Treaty of Plessa in 1583, leaving the Baltic coastline firmly in Swedish hands. When the last truce was signed, the map of the Baltic had changed forever. Muscovy had been pushed back from the sea. Poland-Lithuania and Sweden had strengthened their positions, and Livonia, once a loose confederation of knights, bishops, and merchants, was now carved between greater powers. The Northern Cross had been broken, but in its place rose new symbols of empire. The guns fell silent, but the echoes of 25 years of war lingered like smoke over the Baltic. From Riga to Reval, from the forests of southern Livonia to the shores of the Gulf of Finland, towns were scarred, fields burned, and populations scattered. Entire generations of Livonians had grown up knowing only conflict, famine, and forced marches. Villages that had thrived for centuries lay abandoned, their churches and markets reduced to rubble. Trade shifted dramatically. Riga, once a free city of merchants under the Livonian order, now answered to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Its wealth flowed south and west, along routes controlled by the Commonwealth, while Swedish ports like Reval and Narva became hubs for northern trade, linking the Baltic to the wider Scandinavian markets. Muscovy, cut off from the Baltic by treaties, turned inland, focusing on river commerce and the White Sea. The dream of a Russian window to Europe had been temporarily closed. The nobility and knights of Livonia faced uncertain futures. Many fled north to Swedish-held territories or west to Polish-Lithuanian lands. Others attempted to adapt under new rulers, serving as administrators, mercenaries, or traders. The once proud Order of the Sword, The knights who had once carried the Northern Cross into battle had vanished as a political force, its legacy surviving only in memory, legend, and the scattered ruins of their castles. Yet the Northern Cross endured, not as a military standard, but as a symbol of resilience. In stories told around hearths, in church sermons, and in the tales of wandering mercenaries, the cross represented both the valor of those who fought for Livonia and the price of being caught between empires. It became a metaphor for the Baltic itself, a land of storms, ambition, and fragile alliances, where geography and ambition conspired to make war inevitable. The major powers took their lessons. Poland-Lithuania emerged stronger, controlling southern Livonia and securing key trade routes. Sweden consolidated its northern holdings, establishing a base for future dominance in the eastern Baltic. Denmark, having tested its influence, withdrew to focus on internal matters and the ongoing conflict with Sweden. Muscovy, humiliated but unbroken, began to rebuild its armies, looking westward again, knowing that the dream of the Baltic coast would never fade from Russian ambition. The Northern Cross, once the emblem of a proud but doomed order, had been tested in fire and blood. It had fallen, been reshaped by the ambitions of kings, and survived in memory. The war had ended, but the tides of history would return, carrying new armies, new banners, and new stories across the stormy Baltic waters. The Livonian War may have ended in 1583, but its consequences rippled across the centuries. Borders had shifted, kingdoms had risen and fallen, and the map of the Baltic was forever altered. Poland-Lithuania held southern Livonia, securing access to rivers and trade routes. Sweden controlled the northern ports, laying the foundation for its Baltic dominance in the 17th century. Muscovy, denied a direct path to the sea, began looking to the west and north with renewed determination, planting the seeds for the expansionist policies of future Tsars. For Muscovy, the loss was bitter but instructive. Ivan IV had learned that even a vast, disciplined army could be checked by coalitions, modern fortifications, and disciplined cavalry. The Tsar invested heavily in rebuilding his forces, modernizing artillery, and reforming supply lines. The frustration of being blocked from the Baltic drove Russia to seek alternative ports, eventually turning toward the Archangel in the White Sea and setting the stage for centuries of Russian maritime ambitions. For Sweden and Poland-Lithuania, the war was a catalyst for state consolidation. Sweden's hold on Reval and northern Estonia allowed it to control vital trade routes and develop a naval infrastructure that would later become the backbone of the Swedish Empire. The Commonwealth, meanwhile, reinforced the integration of Livonia into its political and military structure, drawing on local nobility and fortifying key towns. These experiences sharpened both states' military organization, diplomacy, and capacity for multi-front conflict. The Northern Cross itself became a potent symbol. It no longer represented a single order of knights, but the resilience and identity of the Livonian people. In chronicles, poems, and later folklore, the cross came to embody both suffering and defiance. The idea that even when crushed between empires, a people's spirit could endure. Future generations would invoke it when defending their lands or celebrating the bravery of ancestors, ensuring that the mythic essence of the Livonian War survived long after the swords had rusted. Culturally, the war reshaped the Baltic. Towns rebuilt themselves, churches rose from ashes, and trade resumed along the Daugava, Gulf of Finland, and Riga. Yet memories of destruction lingered. Oral traditions spoke of nights when the sky seemed to bleed fire, when columns of Muscovite cavalry marched over frozen rivers, and when the Northern Cross flew defiantly amidst the chaos. Artists and chroniclers preserved these images, blending history with legend, a hallmark of the mythic real tone of the war. By the late 16th century, the Northern Cross had become more than a relic. It was a cautionary emblem for rulers, a rallying symbol for warriors, and a lens through which historians would interpret the delicate balance of power in the Baltic. The echoes of the war shaped diplomatic decisions, military reforms, and territorial ambitions for decades to come. In short, the Livonian War did not just redraw maps, it reshaped minds, strategies, and the very story of the North. The Northern Cross, once a banner of knights, had become a crossroad of empires, a symbol etched into the destiny of the Baltic region. The guns fell silent in 1583, and yet the Baltic never truly knew peace. Forests still whispered of the hoofbeats of Muscovite cavalry, rivers still carried the echoes of siege engines, and towns bore the scars of decades-long conflict. The Northern Cross, once the proud emblem of the Livonian order, now exists as a memory, a symbol of a people caught between the ambitions of kings and the tides of empire. In the centuries that followed, the Baltic became a stage for empires. Sweden would rise, dominating the northern coast and challenging Denmark and Russia alike. Poland-Lithuania would face its own trials, defending Livonia from foreign hands while struggling to maintain unity at home. Muscovy, bruised but unbroken, never forgot the dream of the Baltic ports, returning again and again to assert its presence on these contested shores. The Northern Cross endured in legend. Poets and chroniclers told of knights who had fought with courage unmatched, of civilians who had survived fires and famines, of mercenaries who carried the cross into battle far from home. Its story became mythic real, a blending of history and imagination, of blood and devotion, of hope and despair. Yet beyond legend, the cross symbolized the harsh truth of power. No single banner could hold against ambition, no fortress could withstand time and tide, and no order, however proud, could survive isolation in a world of rising kingdoms. The Northern Cross reminded all who gazed upon it that history is written not just by the victors, but by those who endure, who adapt, and who remember. Standing today on the ruins of Dorpat or the gates of Narva, one can almost feel the pulse of the past. The frost-laden fields, the battered walls, the empty streets, all bear witness to the clash of empires, the strategies of kings, and the courage of men who fought under the cross. It is a memory carved into the Baltic itself, a reminder of a war that shaped the destiny of nations. The Northern Cross, tested in fire and blood, shattered and reforged, remains eternal. It is more than history, it is myth. It is the story of ambition and survival, of empire and identity, and of a small land that became the fulcrum upon which Northern Europe balanced for decades. The Livonian War may have ended, but the legacy of the Northern Cross shines across centuries, a symbol of endurance, struggle, and the eternal clash of human ambition with the tides of fate.